Hello and welcome to Columbia Theological Seminary. My name is Brennan Breed and I teach Old Testament.
And I'm Jake Myers and I teach homiletics.
And welcome to our 2018 Advent Lectionary series. This is the fourth week of Advent. We're going to be discussing the texts that will be part of the lectionary for that week. So we hope that we can provide you with some insights that will help you in your preaching, your teaching, and perhaps even in your devotional life.
The way that Brennan and I thought it would be helpful, or most helpful for you in your preparation for the Advent season, is for us to come at these texts from our disciplinary perspectives, and hopefully that will help to shine some fresh light on the texts and how you might proclaim these texts in your various congregational contexts. And
since I'm an Old Testament professor, I have to start from my discipline, that is Old Testament. And thankfully, we have two good Old Testament texts today. Some of the things that I think are really helpful about some of these texts today, the text from Micah, the first part of Micah chapter 5, and also the Psalm for the day, which is Psalm 80, at least the first half of Psalm 80. Although I always encourage people to look at the whole Psalm. Don't cut your poems in half. But these two texts, I think, are really helpful for pointing out some really interesting things about ancient Israel itself and about ancient Israelite theology, and I think there's a lot for us to learn today. So the Micah text is fascinating, and a lot of times Christians approach Old Testament prophecy, especially around the time of Advent, as if it is simply there to provide a proof text for Jesus. And I always try to ask people to take a step back from that perspective and to try to read the prophets a bit more in their ancient context, precisely because I think it has a lot more to say to us. If we just skip right to Jesus and try to only apply it so that it fits without any remainder in the time of Jesus, we're going to miss what those early Christians knew. When they reapplied these texts, they knew that they were reapplying ancient prophecy to the time of Jesus. And they actually knew the ancient context a lot better than we do today. This text of Micah, I think, is fascinating. The person of Micah is fascinating, and whenever I read a prophetic book, I always encourage people to turn to the superscription, the very beginning of the book. I mean, the word of the Lord that came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of King Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem, in chapter 1, verse 1, the superscription. There's so much data there that I think could be so helpful for us to exegete Micah. I mean, even just beginning with Micah of Moresheth. And so, you know all about Moresheth, right?
Oh yeah, every day. I was at Target the other day, and the lady stopped me and she was asking me all about it.
So. That's right. Everyone talks about it, yeah. No, this is one of the lesser-known places in the Bible, but it's actually really fascinating. Moresheth is a little suburb of Gath, a town that's a Philistine town that was conquered by the Israelites. And in the time of Micah, during his lifetime, and during the century just before his lifetime, this little sleepy agricultural Israelite village transformed into a giant hub of the empire. The Israelite kings, the Judahite kings really, took this little sleepy hamlet and fortified it and turned it into a big walled city. And basically kicked out all the people that would have been living there and working there as farmers, and they got turned into serfs who built this city for free on their own backs with corvée or forced labor, and then had to supply all the taxation and all the stuff to run this military garrison. Micah clearly hates this. Micah doesn't just get upset at people in general. A lot of times we think that when the ancient Israelite prophets start to yell at people, they're yelling at anyone indiscriminately. Everyone's sinful. That's actually not what Micah is saying. Micah is mad at two things, and the superscription tells you exactly what Micah's mad at. Samaria and Jerusalem, the kings, where the kings live. He's really mad about this because he thinks that they've ruined his entire life and the lives of the people who live in his little town. He even gets really mad at Jerusalem and calls it a high place, like one of these places of like bad worship. So he says in verse 5 of chapter 1, the transgression of Jacob and the sins of the house of Israel. What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? And what's the high place of Judah? Is it not Jerusalem? Jerusalem's a place of sin, and not just because it exists as a place of the kings. And in fact, the most radical statement I can find, the most radical political statement I can find in all the Old Testament is in Micah. It's in Micah chapter 3, verse 9. And Micah says, hear this, you rulers of the house of Jacob and the chiefs of the house of Israel. And again, he's getting mad at these rulers and chiefs. Those who abhor justice, who pervert all equity, who build the city of Zion with blood and Jerusalem with wrong. Its rulers give judgment for a bribe. Its priests teach only for a price. Everyone's getting money out of this. And the prophets give oracles for money. Yet they lean upon the Lord God and say, surely the Lord is with us. No harm shall come upon us. Therefore, because of you, Micah says, Zion shall be plowed as a field. Jerusalem is going to become a heap of ruins, and the mountains of the house a wooded height. This is radical because it's one of the contemporaries of Micah, Isaiah, promises all the time that God's going to be with Jerusalem. Zion is a place of peace and security and prosperity where the lion and the lamb are going to lay down together, and there's going to be a beautiful king who's going to help everything be great. And Micah says that picture is not describing what's happening now. What's happening now is that the power in the system is being used to only abuse people. And Micah yells at people about this. So the fascinating thing is that this tension, I think, underlies all of Israelite religion and their ancient experience, that they're escaped slaves, essentially, and they keep reminding themselves, we're escaped slaves. But they also have to keep reminding themselves, we want power, we want some kind of authority in our midst, we want some order, we want protection against other people who might hurt us. And this kind of fundamental tension we can see bubble up even in Micah chapter 5, the text for today. Micah says, "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah," this is where David comes from, this little rural town in Judah, one that might have looked a little bit like Moresheth before it got turned into a military garrison. "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days." This is a reference to that Davidic covenant, the promise that God makes in 2 Samuel 7 is one of the classic statements of this, but of both the city of Jerusalem and to the king, that God is going to be with them. And this is part of that tension. The Mosaic covenant says you can't do whatever you want. You're part of a team, a group, a community, and if you violate those rules, no matter who you are, king included, there are consequences. And the Davidic covenant is in tension with that. It says maybe there aren't so many consequences for Jerusalem and for the Davidic king. And so here we see this other side of the fundamental tension in ancient Israel, the side that we might associate with kind of grace, but also with power, royal power that is emerging. But Micah's spin on it, I think, is that we're going to emphasize the rural nature of this king who's going to come up. It's someone from the middle of nowhere, and their job is not going to be to conquer and dominate, but to feed the flock, verse 4, and in the strength of the Lord and the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, so that the people shall live secure. That is calling to mind the fundamental metaphor for a ruler, the shepherd, which is a kind of positive metaphor of rule in ancient Israel. So in any event, you can see that tension in, I think, Psalm 80 as well, which compares the flight of the people who are worried and distressed and worried about being vulnerable, that they're going to get attacked and destroyed, and then this other tension that they want peace and security from God's protection, which sometimes includes a desire for violence. But then there's another side to it, which is that they know that they come from running away from that kind of violence and domination. So that anyway, I see those kind of that tension running through Advent as well, as a time of concern for kingship and order and rule, but also a worry about what kind of earthly power has done. You have King Herod killing babies in order to preserve his own power, contrasted with this kind of Christ-like figure of the infant king. So in any event, I think both of those are present throughout the Old Testament.
Yeah, well, first of all, this is how you read Scripture, y'all. Like, throw your body into it. Your face should crinkle up in certain ways. So well done, Dr. Breed.
Thanks. Performative.
It was wonderful to see that. And I think that's how we make the leap from the ancient, partly how we make the leap from the ancient Israelite context to our own context, is by the way that we embody the text, by the way that we give life to it and voice to it. T.S. Eliot famously said that the task of the poet is to turn blood into ink. And one of our professors at Princeton Seminary said, the task of the preacher, the reader of Scripture, is to then turn that ink back into blood. And so I appreciate how you brought your full self to that text.
Thanks, yeah.
And looking at the Micah 5 text, I don't talk about Bethlehem of Ephrathah very often either. So this can sound like a land far, far away and very kind of like it would have no bearing on people who are maybe dealing with gentrification in a particular community today, or people who are dealing with purple congregations where the church is kind of divided politically and they're trying to find ways to still be the community of God. Having that both and perspective really helps to kind of shed some new light and some fresh perspective on this. And the way that I would come at this text, both in terms of reading the text and in terms of preaching the text, is to move from tenderness to confidence. If we think about what God, through the prophet Micah, is naming about the identity of Judah, he says, who are one of the little clans of Judah. The little clans. Like, the softer you put that, like the more tender it shows, especially in light of the other stuff you're saying, where it's like wrath, wrath, wrath.
Yeah.
This tenderness and concern for God's people, despite the abuses of power, despite the marginalizations of the poor, that God's grace abounds still. And then this transition in verse 3, therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has brought forth. Then the rest of the kindred shall return to the people of Israel. So there's this like confidence, there's this energy. And I really wanted to focus and this is probably where I would go with the text if I were preaching in my congregational context for this particular day of Advent, is this focus on this promise. And they shall live secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. This quest for security, for God's provision, is not just an idea. It's not a pie in the sky ideal for so many people who are struggling with socioeconomic justice, calling out for it, dealing with marginalization in terms of race or gender or sexual orientation. So I think that this text has so much to say to people who are in these situations of insecurity. And as the market continues to fluctuate and as tweets continue to fly, our congregants are going to become more and more insecure and fearful. So to hear a text like this to remind congregations that in spite of all the turbulent overthrows and abuses of power, that God is still concerned for God's people and God does still provide is huge. And like you said, the Psalm 80 text, I think the key is to really start strong with this text. My advice would be to go big or to go home with this text. This is a lament psalm. And so if we read it kind of mediocre, we lose the opportunity to speak in a different tone for our congregation. We give them freedom and license to cry out to God in spite of, in light of the things that they're experiencing. What we make of this whole restore us, O God, let your face shine that we may be saved. This is repeated again in verse 7. So I would say, depending on one's congregational context, would determine the degree to which one focuses on the we and on the saved. And then I might hit we a little harder when I was reading on the first one and then maybe saved on the next one, or vice versa. But I think that our current cultural realities and the context in which we live call into question what salvation might look like for us, how God might save us from white supremacy, heterosexism. And then this verse 5 is just horrible and beautiful at the same time. You have fed them with the bread of tears and given them tears to drink in full measure. I can't help but think of the work of Dr. Leah Francis Gunning, who spoke at our seminary not too long ago, and her engagement with Black mothers who have experienced the loss of their sons through police violence, and the ways in which the bread of tears and this full measure of tears, I think, is not just something that happened a long time ago to the people of Israel, but it's happening today in our communities. Another text or reference I would like to offer for the preachers is to look at the work of George Yancey. He's a professor of philosophy at Emory University, and he's doing some really powerful stuff engaging racism. His most recent book is called Backlash: What Happens When We Talk Honestly About Racism in America. And it is gut-wrenching, the things that people actually would say to him in response to him just trying to have open and honest conversations about racism in America. So I would definitely check that out.
Yeah, and I think when you point out tenderness and confidence, also the desire to be saved, one of the things I want to point out, and I always try to point this out with prophetic literature, is that we need to preach the tension. We need to give people the tension. We also need to explain. I mean, that's a lament psalm. It starts with people crying out in pain. So often in the Christian experience, especially around Christmas time, people on Easter,
everything's awesome.
Everything's awesome. Everything's great. Things are only good. God only is nice all the time. And we even get this, we'll get to this in a little bit with the Hebrews text, but get this kind of despicable, in my mind, separation between an Old Testament angry God of wrath and a New Testament happy God of rainbows. And then every once in a while you find some kind of like glimmer of like nice things in the Old Testament, like Micah 5, you say, oh, that's the good God, that's the Jesus part of God kind of coming out and things like this. But I think it's important to say that both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, God has anger and wrath. And that's not all bad news, especially for people who are suffering, people who are oppressed, people who are like Micah. Micah is angry not because he's a cranky guy or because he doesn't like order. One example is the folks in the Black Lives Matter movement. They're oftentimes painted as folks who, they're out to disrupt order. They're out to
angry all the time.
Yeah, just all they care about is disruption, and they're just trying to kind of say that only certain lives matter and things like that. But in fact, that crying out, the disruption itself, is a signal that something is wrong. And that's what these prophets are. Micah is screaming out. And in fact, the stuff that Micah says in chapters 1 through 3, he compares the people who live in Samaria and Jerusalem to cannibals. They tear the flesh of my people and eat it. Well, this is because they were taking everything they possibly could. They were confiscating as much as they could from the peasants and eating it all. Like they were eating the lifeblood of the peasants. And this is, it's I think an important image. And then we get to the tenderness and compassion near the end of Micah. But the tenderness and compassion is spoken to the people who've been suffering for a long time. It's not spoken to the people who have guilty souls, because their conscience is guilty because they've been taking stuff from people and they need God to tell them it's okay. But that we need to hear that this is a word of liberation for all people, though. That those people who are in those positions of taking and confiscating and so on, what Micah says is, you're in the midst of blood and guilt, and this is a horrible thing for all of us to experience. And that there is a liberative moment to this kind of, all people are going to be fed, but only if we take note and listen to the voices of certain people that are being persecuted and oppressed. And that tension, I think we can see pop up in the story of Jesus as well. That Jesus cries out on behalf of folks who are being trampled down, and shows us a new way that will only work if we take note of those little babies born in rural places or in places that have been disowned and abandoned and disregarded.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Let's turn ahead to the New Testament a little bit, looking at this very, very famous text in Luke 1:39 through 45. This is a text where I would say vitality or life is the dominant force that we have to find a way to give voice to. This text helps us in ways that some other texts don't as much, because it supplies us with certain descriptors. Mary set out and went with haste to a Judean town in the hill country, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. So here, it would be great if we could bring that energy and that vitality into our voice and into our narration. So what I would try to do if I were delivering this in a congregation is I would try to make eye contact during the narration part, and then I would try to embody and assume the tone of Elizabeth when she's speaking, assume the tone of Mary, not overdoing it. If your expression exceeds your impression of the text, then you're just play acting, and it comes
People
across
get that,
as
yeah.
schmaltzy. You don't want to do that. But we have to think about ways that we can bring some of these moments of celebration and recognizing the socioeconomic and political status of these characters in Scripture, and the way in which they're announcing something that is so exciting and so wonderful and so life-giving for people who are on the margins, people who have been pushed and silenced by history. I would think that this text, not just because it's about women, but because it's about people whose voices are often neglected and silenced, is the Me Too movement. I would think about ways that this might connect in a powerful way. And so what I would try to do, especially with the Mary text starting in verse 46, is to build this. We do something performative and theological when we do it this way. So when Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior." So I wouldn't want to look at the congregation when I was saying this, because she's speaking to God. So, but it's also like not up here. I would start down here, because it's just like, oh my gosh, what is happening? And then to see this kind of build take place, where God's provision for Mary, God's election of Mary, to be the Theotokos, the God bearer, is not something that is just for her, but it blossoms out and expands the way that a pebble is dropped into a pond and it gets bigger and bigger. So then I would want my reading to get more and more exciting and exuberant and inclusive. And so I would probably start with my eyes here, and then I would just start to look up, and then it's just like, it's including all of creation in this. It's just such a beautiful, beautiful text.
Yeah, I do think that this kind of the thinking of how the Magnificat draws very clearly from the history of ancient Israel, to move back to my specialty. But yeah, I mean, how it pulls, and even the intonations that you're giving, like they're similar to the Psalms, because this is really like a psalm that Mary is saying. The phrases that she's using, this is taken pretty much. It's kind of a cobbling together of lament psalm literature in the way that an ancient Israelite would have known it. That is, someone who would have grown up with this stuff in the water, and it was there for people to use and to put it together and to give voice to their own suffering, but also to their own thanksgiving for God's great activity. And you have here this kind of admission of one's own humbleness, and at the end that there is going to be some dramatic overturning that happens in the life of Mary and of the one that she's praising. This kind of experiential praise and prayer and lament and thanksgiving, which always has within it this kind of experience of lament. These are things that I think we need to encourage our congregation to live through, to experience, to see their own life as something that they can narrate and live through. And the acting out is what, the way to kind of embody this through speech and paying attention to the way we read these things and speak them can help people to think, this is something that I might even be able to use as a template for my own life, or to give voice to those parts of my life that are difficult to give voice to. Yeah, so thanks. Thank you for that insight. It's something that I don't pay that much attention to as I'm reading, even if I do sometimes put my own blood into it.
I don't agree. I think you just proved the opposite point in the way you read the Micah text. Thanks. This text, the way that it kind of grabs hold of us, and this flipping around of, like in verse 53, he has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has filled his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promises he made to our ancestors, to Abraham. And then here's where you might want to look at the congregation, and to his descendants forever. And if you bring that joy, then what we're doing right here when we're proclaiming this text is we're doing good pastoral care. Mm-hmm. We're reminding people of their narrative identity. Mm-hmm. That we're not just like little microbes floating through the ether, but we have been grafted into this lineage where God's story of constant watch care and provision for God's people, like we get to be included in that. That should be really good news. Yeah.
And also, I think one thing maybe to point out, so you can draw it homiletically too, is that people in the midst of overturning often aren't comfortable or happy. It seems like things are in a mess today. At that exact same time, periods of overturning are times when God can do some pretty amazing and incredible things. Also, there can be terrible things that happen. We're in a time of great concern and worry, and to get people to help them to interpret their own position in the midst of a topsy-turvy world, by helping them see that God has time and again in the past provided ways for people to survive in the midst of oppression and terror, and also things being overturned. But also that a big part of it is for us to imagine ourselves as part of this long story, this long narrative. And our job may not be to see the story to its conclusion, or to find the end, or to find a place of even security. Personally, communally, in terms of the church, like the narrative of the church is falling apart and so on, we might not be the ones to find security and peace and to figure out what this is all about, what the ending is. We can try to pass along, be as faithful as we can to pass along the story of a God that does, in fact, show up and overturn things and bring good things to those who do suffer.
Yeah, that's a great segue into our Hebrews 5 text, because this text this is a very complicated text in terms of reading the text, because there's a lot going on. It's very mental material, so it's kind of like getting ideas expressed. So we have to find a way to break up the flow of our speaking so that those can come out. Like the metaphor I like to use with my students is, it's like you have a giant Pez dispenser and you're giving out bits of information, like one piece at a time, so that it doesn't just overwhelm the listener. We have narration, where the writer of Hebrews is kind of narrating something that Jesus has already engaged in the past, but then he we have to find a way to also, at the same time, assume Jesus' voice in speaking to God. And this text is one of those dangerous texts that can be used to wield violence against Jews. It's been used historically to do that. And we really find that in verse 9. See, I have come to do your will. This is Jesus in Jesus' voice. He abolishes the first in order to establish the second. And this notion of abolish, I was thinking like, oh, maybe that's not so harsh in Greek. Maybe it's kind of a Hegelian kind of like, you preserve what's good in the thing, which you get rid of the bad stuff, and it gets better as you move through history. But no, the word actually is also used to mean murder. So what do we do with this supersessionism that we find in Hebrews? Old Testament scholar.
Well, the first thing is to admit it's there, and to admit it's throughout the New Testament. That there's there at least are texts that could be used as supersessionist texts that exist throughout the New Testament. It's like raw materials or resources for people who would later establish them as a very powerful people. That is Christians, right? Christianity, when the New Testament is under the process of being constructed, are weak. They are a minority folk. They are a folk that don't really have a place within the empire. They're a folk that are still, at the time of the New Testament, somewhat indistinguishable from Judaism as a whole. There may be a sect of Jews, or they're kind of on the borderline margins of Judaism. And then there's the question of the Gentiles who want to be Jesus followers. There were also Gentiles who were part of the synagogue system and were Jewish, but God-fearers, sort of half Jewish in a way, or somewhat hangers on to the synagogue. And so there's this, it was a much more amorphous definition of what is a Christian, what is a Jew, until the time of the Great Separation, which is later. But of course, then Christianity becomes the major world dominant religion, at least in the Mediterranean basin and in Europe and North Africa and in the Middle East. And when you have Constantinian Christianity, this can all be weaponized, right, in order to kill, to exclude, and of course it was used before that in violent ways as well. But yeah, this kind of rejection, or the notion that Christ gives us a new way which makes the old bad. I think that is problematic, theologically problematic. We just need to point that out. We need to say, look, there's some texts in here in the New Testament that maybe you can interpret them in some ways to kind of deaden that, or try to make it less harsh. But they're at least there for us to use them that way, and we need to recognize that. And also we need to reject that temptation. Stuff in the Old Testament too, the conquest narratives, which you don't have time to explain all of that now, but I mean, there are certain ways you can read the conquest narratives that end up leading people to commit genocide. And we should note that. We should say these resources are here in the text, and we need to...
And have been used to justify that.
Have been used to do that in say, the history of the United States, right? But we need to reject that and lay those weapons down in a way and disarm from them. And this is one of them. I mean, one of the ways to encounter this is to say I don't necessarily want to agree with all of the practical consequences of the theology of the author of Hebrews, in the same way that I don't want to say Paul's view of women gets to dictate exactly how I want women to be treated in the church today. So the way that the author of Hebrews thinks about Judaism and Jews, I'm going to say I would rather have Paul's view, at least Paul's view in Romans 9-11, where he grapples with this question of how Christians and Jews, that is, followers of Jesus, especially those who are Gentile, are going to relate to either Jewish Jesus followers or Jews who are not Jesus followers, right? How are Gentiles going to relate to Jews if they both say they're worshiping the same God? Even though Gentiles want to retain some of their cultural history and cultural practices and so on, and they don't want to become, that is, culturally Jewish, what do? And as Paul says, we get grafted in, and you've already used that term today. I mean, it's from Paul in Romans 9-11. The Christians have a way through Jesus to be grafted in to the community. So I might reread this and say, you know what? I have a slight disagreement here with the author of Hebrews. Maybe the author of Hebrews is right, has the best theology in the world, but at least for me, I need to look at this and say, maybe he grafts us into the first in order to establish the second, or he opens a way in the first in order to establish the second. I think that we need to admit that word murder, right, abolishment, tends to, in Christian communities, especially ones that have power these days, tends to lead us to practical outcomes that are deplorable. Sorry.
Yeah, and Dr. Amy Jill Levine, who teaches at Vanderbilt Divinity School, has a really great thing that I think all Christian preachers should bear in mind in her book, The Misunderstood Jew. she said that somehow like there's this tendency that's crept into Christianity where we feel like in order to make Jesus like the superhero, we have to like denigrate all of the people that Jesus is talking to and all the old customs. And there's a very well-worn groove in the history of Christianity to kind of place like Christianity with it's like about faith and it's about like it's vibrant and it's living, and Judaism is no it's just ritual, rote, dead sacrifices and offerings that have no internal significance. That's a false distinction. And even as you so wonderfully brought out in the Micah text, where there's this, if we only focused on the good news and the positive, and we don't look at the larger socio-political milieu into which this good news arises, we do the text disservice. If we just focus in the Hebrews text on verse 9 and like, oh, good, abolish, then what we're trying to do is we're trying to use Christianity as a weapon, and we're doing exactly what Nietzsche said Christians were doing anyway, which is it's another form of the will to power. And Barth and later Reformed theologians said absolutely not. And we see this in verse 7. The text reads, "Then I said, 'See, God, I have come to do your will, O God.'" So I think this is a nice touch point with Reformed theology, where we don't talk about God, and Calvin said it's ludicrous to talk about God in some abstract metaphysical sense. We only know God because God has chosen to reveal God's self to us in Jesus Christ. So, and I read something today that is so apropos for this text, and it said that the sovereignty of God is not the will to power, it's the will to love. And so if we think about that, verse 7 kind of shining light on verse 9 and just kind of in a very concentrated way, where the fullness of Jesus' personhood, Jesus' obedience to the Father, Jesus' care for the marginalized and the oppressed, Jesus' care for his own Jewish brothers and sisters and others, gives us a way to put text in critical conversation with himself, the way that our colleague emeritus Walter Brueggen might say there's this testimony of Scripture and there is counter-testimony, that these things have to be held in tension. And out of that tension, we are able to see God more fully and to be living in a more meaningful shalom-esque community where all are included in God's reign and God's glory.
Yeah, and admit that there are supersessionists, that is parts of our theology that where Christians want to say that Christ makes everything else obsolete. We might want to also canonically point to other parts of the canon that encourage us to think about how God has always been at work in all parts of the world, and that open us up to trying to listen and to be careful to hear the voices of God in whoever we meet, and that God is revealed in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, at least in my theology, is involved in the creation of the world, and this that we can encounter God in the lives, and we can encounter Christ in the lives of people who are entirely different from us, and that kind of temptation, the will to power, that we are going to dominate. You can see that running from Micah and Psalms all the way through here to Hebrews. It's a temptation for us in our Advent preaching as well, and for our own involvement in institutions and in churches, in our nonprofits, all of the different places in our world that we're involved in. We are tempted to claim the power of Pharaoh, is another way to think about it, or the power of Herod. And in fact, we are called to lay down our weapons and seek peace. And you can see that temptation in all these texts as well. I mean, not temptation, but good temptation.
Yeah, especially in contexts where Christianity is the dominant religious power. That temptation to try to seize the power and to try to enforce other people to speak the way that we want them to speak, and to live in community the way that we want them to live in community. It reminds me of something that Karl Barth stressed in his writings, is that we're always in this tension of hastening and waiting. And I think Advent is that season where we really stress the waiting part, but there's that hastening undercurrent that I think all of these texts are bearing witness to in different ways.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I've at least, I feel like I could preach these texts. How about you?
Yeah.
All right.
I definitely want to hear you preach these texts.
Well, I mean, you're the homiletics guy. Come on now. All right. Well, from all of us here at Columbia Seminary to all of you out there watching, thank you so much for spending your time with us. I've learned a lot even just by talking with my colleague here. We also, whenever we go out and visit congregations, especially folks who are preaching, who are CTS alums and things like that, we really love to encounter you, and we'd love to hear your preaching. So feel free to drop us a line and tell us if this message was at all helpful for you, or to give us critical feedback at Jake Myers and Brennan Breed. So thank you so much for your time, and have a blessed Advent, Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year.
Yeah, Advent blessings to you and to yours.